Welcome to your new home, sweetheart.
Moving into Willow Creek Estates felt like stepping into a postcard. The manicured lawns stretched in perfect green lines, each blade of grass seemingly cut to regulation height. The houses stood like soldiers at attention, their shutters all painted in approved shades of colonial blue, forest green, or classic black. My wife Sarah and I had saved for years to afford this slice of suburban paradise. And watching our 7-year-old daughter Emma skip up the driveway of our new home for the first time made every penny worth it. That first week was a whirlwind of unpacking boxers, arranging furniture, and introducing ourselves to neighbors. Most people were friendly enough, offering waves from their driveways or brief conversations about trash pickup schedules and the best pizza delivery in town. But it was on day 5 that we met Margaret Henderson, the woman who would turn our dream home into a waking nightmare. Margaret appeared at our door on a Tuesday morning, clipboard in hand, wearing a cream-colored pantsuit that looked freshly pressed despite the summer humidity. Her silver hair was set in tight curls that didn't move, even when she shook her head disapprovingly at our welcome mat, which featured a cheerful cartoon dog that apparently violated Section 7.3.2 of the HOA bylaws regarding frivolous outdoor decorations. "I'm the HOA president," she announced, not waiting for an invitation before stepping into our foyer. Her eyes scanned our entryway like a general surveying enemy territory. "I see you've already made several violations. The mat, of course, and those curtains in your front window are half an inch too long, according to our standards. They're creating an uneven hemline that disrupts the aesthetic harmony of the street." Sarah and I exchanged glances, trying to determine if this woman was serious. The look on Margaret's face, pinched and severe, like she'd been sucking on lemons, suggested she absolutely was. I attempted a friendly smile, hoping to diffuse whatever tension was building in the air between us. "We weren't aware there were regulations about curtain length," I said carefully. "We just moved in, and we're still learning all the rules. Maybe you could give us a copy of the bylaws." Margaret's thin lips pressed even thinner. "They were in your closing documents. Ignorance is not an excuse. I expect these violations corrected within 48 hours, or you'll receive your first fine." She made a note on her clipboard with sharp, aggressive strokes. "I'll be conducting a full exterior inspection of your property this Friday at 10 o'clock sharp. I trust you'll be available." Before we could answer, Emma came bounding down the stairs, her pigtails bouncing, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit. She was humming a song from her favorite cartoon, completely oblivious to the ice-cold atmosphere that had descended over our entryway. When she saw we had a visitor, she did exactly what we'd taught her to do. She smiled brightly and extended her small hand in greeting. "Hi, I'm Emma. We just moved here. Do you have any kids I can play with?" Margaret looked at Emma's outstretched hand as if it were covered in something unpleasant. She didn't take it, didn't return the smile, didn't soften even a fraction at the sight of this eager, friendly child trying to make a new friend. Instead, she took a step backward, her nose wrinkling slightly. "Children in Willow Creek Estates are expected to maintain appropriate noise levels at all times," Margaret said, addressing us rather than Emma. "That includes indoor activities. I could hear singing from outside, which suggests poor sound insulation or excessive volume. Please ensure your child understands the community standards for acceptable behavior." Emma's smile faltered, confusion clouding her bright eyes. She lowered her hands slowly, looking up at me for explanation. My protective instincts flared hot in my chest, but Sarah placed a gentle hand on my arm, her touch a reminder to stay calm, to not make enemies on our first week in the neighborhood. "Emma's just excited about the move," Sarah said, her voice tight but polite. "We'll keep the noise down. Thank you for stopping by, Mrs. Henderson." It was a clear dismissal, but Margaret didn't seem to register it. She spent another 10 minutes walking through our first floor, pointing out violations we didn't know existed. Our kitchen backsplash was too modern for the neighborhood's traditional aesthetic. The small wind chime Sarah had hung on our back porch created noise pollution. The flowers I'd planted in the front bed were the wrong species apparently. Only pre-approved perennials were permitted, and my cheerful impatience were decidedly not on the list. By the time Margaret finally left, Emma had retreated to her room, her earlier excitement dampened. Sarah and I stood in our kitchen, surrounded by moving boxers and a growing sense of dread. This was supposed to be our fresh start, our dream home, where we'd build memories and watch Emma grow up in a safe, beautiful community. Instead, we'd just encountered a woman who seemed determined to make our lives miserable over curtain lengths and welcome mats. "She's just one person," Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Surely not everyone in the HOA is like that." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think that Margaret Henderson was an aberration, a minor annoyance we could navigate around. But the look in her eyes, when she'd ignored Emma's friendly greeting, the satisfaction she seemed to take in cataloging our violations, the way she'd moved through our home like she owned it set off alarm bells. I couldn't quite silence. If I had known then what I know now, I would have put our house back on the market that very day. But hindsight is always clearer than foresight, and we were committed to making Willow Creek Estates work. We had no idea that Margaret Henderson's obsession with control would escalate far beyond clipboards and bylaws, or that her actions would eventually put our daughter in physical danger. All we knew was that our perfect neighborhood had just revealed its first crack, and we were trying desperately to convince ourselves that wasn't a sign of deeper fractures to come. The next 3 months felt like living under constant surveillance. Margaret Henderson made it her personal mission to monitor every aspect of our lives, appearing at random times with her clipboard and camera, documenting violations both real and imagined. We corrected the curtains, removed the welcome mat, and replanted the front garden with approved species, but it was never enough. She found new infractions daily. Our garbage bins were placed 3 inches too far from the curb. Our car was parked at a slight angle in our own driveway. Emma's bicycle was visible from the street when it should have been stored in the garage. Each violation came with a fine, and the fines were adding up. We'd already paid over $800 in HOA penalties, and we'd only been living there for 12 weeks. I tried reasoning with Margaret, attending HOA board meetings where I discovered she'd stacked the board with her friends' retired neighbors, who spent their days looking for rule violations because they had nothing better to do. Every appeal we filed was denied. Every request for leniency was met with lectures about maintaining property values and respecting community standards. But Margaret's obsession went beyond mere rule enforcement. She began showing up at our house unannounced, claiming she needed to inspect our yard for compliance issues. She'd peer through our windows if we didn't answer quickly enough. She started timing how long our guests stayed parked on the street, ready to issue citations if they exceeded the 2-hour maximum. Neighbors began avoiding us, not because they disliked us, but because association with rule breakers might bring Margaret's scrutiny to their own homes. The situation took a darker turn when Margaret decided that Emma was a particular problem. Our daughter was a normal, energetic 7-year-old who loved playing outside. She'd ride her bike on our driveway, draw with sidewalk chalk on our walkway, and occasionally play hopscotch on our front path. All of these activities were technically within our property boundaries, but Margaret declared them visually disruptive and inconsistent with the dignified atmosphere of Willow Creek Estates. She began photographing Emma. We'd look out the window and see Margaret across the street, her phone raised, taking pictures of our daughter playing. When I confronted her about it, she claimed she was documenting violations and that Emma's unauthorized outdoor recreational activities were creating a nuisance. I called the police, but they said that photographing someone visible from a public street wasn't illegal, and that HOA disputes were civil matters they couldn't intervene in. Sarah started having panic attacks. The stress of constant monitoring, the financial drain of endless fines, and the creeping realization that we were trapped in a contract we couldn't easily escape was taking a toll on both of us. Emma's personality began to change too. She became quieter, more anxious, constantly asking if she was allowed to do things. The confident, joyful child who'd bounced down our stairs that first week was being replaced by a nervous little girl who was afraid of making mistakes. We consulted a lawyer about breaking our HOA contract, but the penalties for doing so were astronomical, nearly $50,000 in fees and forfeiture of our deposit. We'd leveraged everything to buy this house. Walking away wasn't financially possible. We were stuck, and Margaret knew it. I could see it in the small, satisfied smile she wore whenever she handed us another violation notice. Then came the incident that changed everything, or at least, that we thought changed everything. It was a Saturday morning in late October, and Emma had asked if she could go outside to collect fall leaves for an art project. Sarah said yes, reminding her to stay in our yard. I was upstairs working when I heard raised voices outside. I rushed to the window and saw Margaret in our front yard, her face red with anger, berating Emma about stepping on a section of grass that was apparently designated as a no-traffic zone, according to some obscure landscaping. Emma was crying, clutching her bag of leaves, trying to apologize. Margaret was leaning down, her finger pointing in Emma's face, her voice carrying clearly through the glass. "Children who can't follow simple rules don't deserve to live in nice neighborhoods," Margaret was saying. "Maybe your parents should move somewhere more appropriate for people who don't respect property standards." I was out the door in seconds, placing myself between Margaret and my daughter. "Get away from her," I said, my voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Don't you ever speak to my child again." Margaret didn't back down. She was violating Section 12.47 of the landscaping codes. "This is a documented offense. You'll receive the fine by Monday. I don't care about your fine. Stay away from my family." "This is exactly the kind of hostile attitude that makes you unsuitable for this community," Margaret said, pulling out her phone. "I'm documenting this verbal assault. The absurdity of it, that defending my crying daughter from harassment was being framed as assault, nearly broke me." Sarah appeared then, having heard the commotion, and gently guided Emma inside while I stood there, staring at this woman who had made terrorizing my family her full-time occupation. Neighbors had come out of their houses, drawn by the shouting, but no one intervened. They just watched, probably grateful it was us in Margaret's crosshairs instead of them. After that confrontation, we implemented new rules. Emma wasn't allowed outside in the front yard anymore. She could only play in the back, behind our privacy fence where Margaret couldn't see her. We installed cameras around our property to document our own compliance and to have evidence if Margaret trespassed. We began keeping a detailed log of every interaction with her, every violation notice, every fine, building a case for harassment that our lawyer said might be strong enough to take to court, but court would be expensive, time-consuming, and uncertain. Meanwhile, we had to live here, had to endure Margaret's daily presence in our lives. The stress was crushing us. Sarah barely slept anymore. I was short-tempered at work, unable to focus. Emma had started having nightmares about a mean lady who wanted to take our house away. We thought we'd reached the bottom, that things couldn't possibly get worse. We thought that by limiting Emma's outdoor time and meticulously following every single rule, we could outlast Margaret's obsession, that eventually she'd get bored and move on to tormenting someone else. We were wrong. Margaret's fixation on our family wasn't about rules or property values. It was about power, about control, about the satisfaction she derived from making others miserable. And she was just getting started. The real horror was still to come. On an ordinary Wednesday afternoon when Margaret would cross a line so egregious, so dangerous, that it would finally expose her for what she truly was. It started with what seemed like an olive branch. On a cold Wednesday in early November, Margaret appeared at our door with what could almost pass for a smile on her usually stern face. She was carrying a basket of muffins, blueberry, homemade, still warm from the oven. Sarah answered the door, immediately wary but trying to remain polite. "I've been doing some reflecting," Margaret said, her tone softer than we'd ever heard it. "I think perhaps I've been too harsh. I'm very passionate about maintaining our community standards, but I realize I may have gone overboard. I'd like to make amends." Sarah's defenses were up, but exhaustion and the desperate hope for peace made her consider the offer. "That's unexpected," she said carefully. "I thought perhaps Emma might enjoy a baking lesson," Margaret continued. "I used to teach children's cooking classes before I retired. It could be a nice way for us to start over, and she'd learn a valuable skill. What do you say? This Saturday afternoon?" Every instinct screamed at Sarah to say no, but she was so tired of the constant conflict, the stress, the fear. Maybe Margaret genuinely wanted to change. Maybe this was her awkward way of apologizing. Sarah made the mistake of hoping. "Let me talk to my husband," Sarah said, taking the muffin basket. That evening, we debated it for hours. I was completely against it. Margaret had spent months making our lives hell, and I didn't trust this sudden change of heart. But Sarah, worn down by months of fighting, thought maybe giving Margaret a chance to prove herself might help. Our lawyer had said that documentation of attempted reconciliation could help our harassment case. If we showed good faith and Margaret continued her behavior, it would look worse for her. Against my better judgment, we agreed. One baking session in Margaret's home on Saturday afternoon. Emma was cautiously excited. She loved baking, and the idea of learning new recipes appealed to her. We established clear ground rules. I would walk Emma to Margaret's house, which was just 4 doors down. Sarah would pick her up exactly 2 hours later. Emma would keep her phone in her pocket and call us immediately if anything felt wrong. Saturday arrived gray and chilly. Emma wore her favorite purple sweater and carried a small apron Sarah had bought for her. As we walked to Margaret's house, she chattered nervously about what they might bake. I squeezed her hand, reminding her of our safety rules, telling her we were just a phone call away. Margaret answered the door in a floral apron, her kitchen visible behind her, looking warm and inviting with copper pots hanging from hooks and the smell of vanilla in the air. "Right on time," she said. "Come in, Emma. We're going to make chocolate chip cookies and maybe some brownies if we have time." I hesitated at the threshold. "I'd like to see the kitchen set up," I said, "just to make sure everything's safe." Margaret's smile tightened, but she stepped aside. I did a quick survey. The kitchen looked normal, clean, well organized. The gas stove was older but appeared functional. Nothing seemed immediately dangerous. I told myself I was being paranoid, that Margaret wouldn't actually harm a child, that this was just baking. "I'll be back in 2 hours," I told Emma, kissing the top of her head. "Be good. Call if you need anything." I walked home with dread pooling in my stomach, but I pushed it down. Sarah and I spent those 2 hours in a state of all anxiety, checking our phones constantly, nearly calling several times just to check in. But we'd promised to give Margaret a chance to let this play out. We didn't hear Emma's first scream. Margaret's house was too far away, and she'd clearly planned this moment for when she knew we wouldn't be able to immediately intervene. But we heard the second scream, because Emma had bolted from Margaret's house and sprinted down the sidewalk, her phone in her hand, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. Sarah and I met her in the driveway. Emma crashed into Sarah's arms, her whole body shaking, tears streaming down her face, words tumbling out in a terrified rush. "She tried to hurt me. She tried to make me burn myself. She grabbed my hand and tried to push it onto the stove. Time seemed to stop. Sarah's face went white. I felt my blood turn to ice, then to fire. "What did you say?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. Through her sobs, Emma told us what happened. They'd been baking cookies, measuring ingredients, mixing the dough. Everything was fine until Margaret started talking about lessons and consequences, and how some children need to learn the hard way about following rules. Emma said she didn't understand what Margaret meant, so she just kept helping with the cookies. Then, without warning, Margaret had grabbed Emma's wrist hard enough to leave marks we could now see forming on her pale skin and started forcing her hand toward one of the active gas burners on the stove. The flame was on high, blue, and hot, inches from Emma's small finger, she said. I needed to learn what happens to people who don't follow the rules. Emma sobbed. She said I was a bad influence on the neighborhood and that my parents needed to be taught a lesson through me. I pulled away and tried to run, but she held on, and she was so strong, and she kept pushing my hand closer to the fire, and I could feel how hot it was, and I thought she was really going to do it. Emma had finally managed to wrench free, kicking Margaret's shin hard enough to break the woman's grip. She'd run from the house, screaming, with Margaret shouting after her about how she was overreacting and being dramatic. I was already moving, already halfway down the sidewalk toward Margaret's house, a red haze of rage clouding my vision. Sarah called after me, but I couldn't stop, couldn't think, could only process that this woman had tried to physically harm my child, had attempted to burn her, had grabbed her and terrorized her, and Margaret was standing on her front porch, arms crossed, her face set in an expression of righteous indignation. "Your daughter is a little liar," she called out as I approached. She knocked over a measuring cup and invented this whole story to avoid getting in trouble. "I was simply trying to teach her proper kitchen safety. You grabbed her wrists and tried to force her hand onto a lit burner," I said, my voice shaking. "She has bruises." She was crying and terrified. "I'm calling the police right now. You've no proof?" It's her word against mine. I'm a respected member of this community, a retired educator, the HOA president. Who do you think they'll believe, me or some child who's probably been coached by parents who have been violating community rules since the day they moved in? The gaslighting, the casual cruelty, the complete lack of remorse, it was all there in her voice, her stance, her cold eyes. She genuinely believed she'd get away with this. She thought her position, her reputation, her status as HOA president would shield her from consequences. She was wrong. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, keeping my eyes locked on Margaret. "I need to report an assault on a child," I said, clearly. "A woman attempted to burn my 7-year-old daughter's hand on a gas stove. We have physical evidence bruising on her wristband. We need police and possibly paramedics." Margaret's expression shifted from smug certainty to something more uncertain. "You're making a huge mistake," she said. "This is going to make your life in this neighborhood impossible." "You already did that," I replied. "The difference is, now everyone's going to know exactly what kind of person you are." The police arrived within 8 minutes, 2 officers who initially seemed skeptical of our claims, until they saw Emma still crying, trembling, the bruises on her wrist already darkening to deep purple. The female officer's expression hardened when Emma, in a small, broken voice, recounted what happened. The male officer went to speak with Margaret, who had retreated into her house. Sarah had called our lawyer, who was already on his way. Neighbors had emerged from their houses, drawn by the police cars. The commotion, the spectacle of Margaret Henderson finally being held accountable for her actions. The police photographed Emma's injuries, took her statement, and then took mine and Sarah's statements. They asked for permission to examine Margaret's kitchen, which she refused, claiming they needed a warrant. That refusal, our lawyer later told us, was one of the stupidest things she could have done. It made her look guilty, and it gave the police probable cause to secure the scene while they applied for an emergency warrant. Within hours, they had it. They found exactly what Emma had described: the gas stove with fingerprints on the dial that had been turned too high, and more damning, security camera footage from Margaret's own system. She'd installed cameras throughout her house, including in her kitchen, as part of her obsessive documentation habits. She'd apparently forgotten to turn them off before attempting to harm Emma. The footage showed everything: Margaret grabbing Emma's wrist, the child's face shifting from confusion to terror, Margaret forcing Emma's hand toward the flame while talking to her in a calm, measured voice about lessons and consequences. It showed Emma struggling, crying, finally managing to kick free and run. It was incontrovertible evidence of attempted assault on a minor, child endangerment, and potentially attempted battery. Margaret was arrested that evening, still insisting that she'd done nothing wrong, that she was the real victim, that this was all a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by problem residents who'd never fit into Willow Creek Estates. The story exploded across the community and then on to local news. HOA president arrested for attempting to burn child made headlines. The security footage, after being used in court, was leaked online. Within days, Margaret Henderson became nationally infamous as HOA Karen. her face appearing on social media. Her actions dissected and condemned by millions of people. The HOA board immediately distanced themselves from her, issuing statements about how they were shocked and appalled by her actions. Despite having enabled her tyrannical behavior for years, several board members resigned. An emergency election was held, and new leadership took over people who were actually interested in community building rather than rule enforcement. Our lawyer filed both criminal and civil suits. The criminal case was straight. Video evidence was damning, and Margaret's defense attorney advised her to take a plea deal. She was convicted of attempted assault and child endangerment, sentenced to 2 years in prison, followed by probation, and ordered to undergo psychological evaluation and treatment. She was also issued a permanent restraining order requiring her to stay at least 500 feet from Em and our family. The civil suit was more complex but ultimately successful. We sued Margaret personally for assault, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and harassment. We also sued the HOA for enabling her behavior, failing to respond to our complaints about her conduct, and creating an environment where her escalating obsession went unchecked. The settlements from both cases were substantially enough to pay off our mortgage, cover Emma's therapy costs for years to come, and compensate us for the months of hell we'd endured. Margaret's house went into foreclosure. She lost everything: her home, her reputation, her freedom. Sometimes I wonder if she understands, even now, what drove her to such extremes. Was it really about property values and community standards? Or was it something darker, a need to dominate, to control, to punish anyone who didn't submit to her authority? Emma's recovery was longer and harder than we'd hoped. She had nightmares for months, terror of fire, anxiety around new people, especially older women. We found an excellent child therapist who specialized in trauma, and slowly, painfully, Emma began to heal. She'd never be exactly the same child she was before. Trauma changes you, reshapes you, but she was strong. She was a survivor. The neighborhood changed too. Without Margaret's reign of terror, Willow Creek Estates became what it should have been, all along a community where people actually knew their neighbors, where children could play outside without fear of documentation, where common sense replaced rigid rule enforcement. The new HOA leadership repealed many of Margaret's more absurd bylaws. Welcome mats came back. Gardens bloomed with unapproved flowers. The neighborhood became a place of life and laughter rather than fear and conformity. We stayed, which surprised some people, but this was our home. We'd fought for it, bled for it, nearly lost our daughter, defending our right to live here in peace. We weren't going to let Margaret Henderson's cruelty drive us away. Instead, we became advocates for HOA reform, working with legislators to create stronger oversight of homeowners associations and better protections for residents against abusive enforcement. 3 years have passed now. Emma is 10, thriving in school, an advocate herself for children's safety, and speaking up against bullies. She gives talks at her school about what happened to her, turning her trauma into education, her pain into purpose. Sarah's anxiety has eased, though she still has moments of hypervigilance, still checks door locks multiple times, still watches Emma more closely than perhaps she needs to. I think about Margaret sometimes. Wonder what her life is like now, post-release, registered as someone who harmed a child, unable to return to the neighborhood she once ruled like a fiefdom. I don't feel satisfaction in her downfall. There's no joy in watching someone destroy themselves, but I feel relief that she can't hurt anyone else, that her particular brand of toxic control has been exposed and stopped. The scar on Emma's psyche will never fully disappear, just as the physical scars on her wrists faint now, but still visible. If you know to look, remain as evidence of what she survived. The scars are also proof of healing, evidence that wounds can close, though we're stronger than the things that try to break us. Willow Creek Estates is peaceful now. Children ride bikes on driveways, chalk drawings appear on walkways, wind chimes sing in the breeze. The lawns are still green, the house is still beautiful, but now there's warmth here too, community, humanity, the kind of neighborhood we always hoped it would be. And if Emma's scream that day stopped our whole house, it ultimately stopped Margaret's reign of terror too.